I want everyone watching this raise their hand and tell me if they actually avidly read comics. I'm serious, by the way. This is Blue's Clues. Participate. Really? Alright. Well, anyways, adaptations. What are they? Well, they're basically making one medium from another medium, and this can be anything completely interchangeable. It can be from films to comics, films to video games to film, video games to comics, comics to video games, and from comics to film. Many different adaptations exist, but I'm mainly focusing on one transition in this video, and that's comics, or manga, to film. Several film adaptations from comics exist, so many that it's actually become one of the most profitable genres of film in the world. That means it must be pretty easy to take a comic and transfer it over into a film, right? Yeah, not really. There are a lot of bad adaptations out there, especially when the trend was starting to catch on with things like Elektra and Spawn. And this may be due to the amount of money-grubbing producers that want to make as much money as possible on the product that fat, stinky nerds like myself will go out and see.
They weren't making it up.
They assume that, yeah, this comic is big and in right now, so it's probably going to make a lot of money regardless of how good or bad it was. And all we should focus on is advertising. Put everything on a Mountain Dew can, make Burger King toys for the kids, and brand it everywhere in stores, and boom! You're gonna make bank. But hear me out. What if the main problem was not of the producer's greed, but of interpretation? Because, let's be honest, I think it's a lot harder to envision a book and its characters when you have no frame of reference for who they are aside from details you're given in the book. What if a director or a producer saw a comic differently compared to that of majority opinion, or even wanted to tell the audience the story they were told? This is when things get tricky because we don't always know the answer to these things with certain filmmakers. The definition of adaptation gets blurred due to this question, and one wonders if the films are adaptations or interpretations. Some films can be seen as both, or don't bother with these questions and create their own continuity like what most comic book movies do. The thing with comic books that makes them really easy to handle is that, for the most part, there are so many reboots, alternate realities, and retcons that shape the view of the characters for the public, and movies can take these familiar characters and make their own origin story or adaptation without completely being foreign to the source material. But with something like manga or a graphic novel, it's really different. You see, the main adaptation of a manga is seen through anime. And what's really interesting about how manga is adapted, it's almost seen as transferring the panels, word for word sometimes, into a visually moving narrative. The process is really delicate, not only because it's trying to make the film look as on point to the manga as possible, but it tries to give us the same feeling without using much of our own imagination. So really, if people watch the adaptation first, chances are it'll help them get through the original source material better because they have sound, sights, and even timing for their viewing pleasure. However, when an audience is fresh off the source material and goes in to watch the new adaptation, chances are there's never really going to be an entirely consenting opinion on if the adaptation did it absolutely right. There are so many things that a comic can make you feel or act out in your head, and oftentimes it's not the same as what you thought you would hear in the adaptation. This is either from A, stylistic choice, B, original intent, or C, director's interpretation. Or D is both B and C if, the director and content creator are the same thing. And it's not just staying close to the source material, execution needs to be on point as well, whether it's pacing or the acting. Some characters can transition really well.
I'm sorry. Really? Hey, I'm not gonna explode, okay?
Yeah.
You should get some rest. But I'm fine, really. I've never felt better.
While some are just...
I drifted.
Where did I lose you?
elevator in Switzerland.
So you heard none of it?
I'm sorry. I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm not a therapist. It's not my training.
So?
I don't have the
What, the time?
temperament.
To me, the criteria for a perfect adaptation is as follows. It follows the same tone and themes as the source material. Throughout the story, the characters follow the same beats and arcs, and the details and visuals are captured as dramatically as possible within their panels. And so the best examples of perfect adaptations I can mention are 300, Sin City, and Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. I'd go over why these fit all the criteria I mentioned above, but I would be here for an hour instead of the time specified for the video. So I'm actually going to be mentioning certain things I don't see in other adaptations that make these films extra special.
To get that friend of yours to come running.
Sin City and some of its sequels should just be the standard of how to put a graphic novel to film. Not only did they choose to be stylistically accurate to the film, but every angle in the film was crafted after a panel in the graphic novel. This is because they used the actual graphic novel as a storyboard for the film. I often wonder why most comic-to-film movies don't do this anymore. It could be because of interpretation argument I made earlier, but it could be because they want to make a comic look something more like a rather film than a comic. I guess according to this bozo, they're not doing a pretty good job. But what does this guy know? It's not like he's... Oh. Anyways, 300 does something really interesting that I never really noticed, and that's they tend to pace out a scene from a panel depending on the way the panel is structured within the novel. This can either be from slowdown shots to pauses, and holds on certain faces to match the intensity of a scene. This is really cool, and honestly, going back to manga and anime for a sec, this is something I never tend to see experimented with unless it's a certain studio or a certain director being involved. The late Yasuhiro Takamoto pulled off things like this in The Disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya, especially near the end of the movie when Kyon defended Nagato.
私が再び異常動作を起こさないという確証はない。私がここに存在し続ける限り、私の内部のエラーも蓄積し続ける。それはとても危険なこと。
クソったれと伝えろ。お前の親玉に言ってくれ。お前が消えるなりいなくなるなりしたらいいか、俺は暴れるぞ。何としてでもお前を取り戻しに行く。俺には何の脳もないが、春日を焚きつけるぐらいならできるんだ。
Pacing can be a lot for comic readers because sometimes the reader can build more tension themselves than an adaptation can. A scene that's meant for you to reflect on the moment and information given in the story can ultimately be ruined by not enough time given to ponder in an adaptation. Some readers may almost feel rushed away from the moment to move on to the next bit of information, but 300 seems to nail the transition of pacing from graphic novel to film very well. Everything feels in place, and you're given enough room to process the information while also experiencing the visuals.
It won't be long before they fear my spears more than your whips.
It's not the lash they fear.
Finally, we have Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, which differentiates from most adaptations by, like Sin City, preserving the overall aesthetic and tone of the comics. But this time, it also adds a style of what the world Scott and Ramona belong to is like. Most alternative culture is presented pretty poorly in mainstream media. So when Scott Pilgrim came around and decided to nail the kind of culture and aesthetic its readers are familiar with in a way that didn't feel...
The fate of Doctor Who's TARDIS will be decided by a Game of Thrones-inspired deathmatch on the battlefield of Thundercats versus Transformers.
Fuck you! Where was the joke? He just fucking named a bunch of shit! How is this comedy?
It felt right. It was an amazing transition that not only kept the characters for the most part intact, but it also gave us something we wanted, and that's a look at how these characters would act in our reality. Now, would I say these films are perfect? No. But they fit what I consider to be the absolute best way to adapt their source material. Unless you actually animated your graphic novel in the same style and had the creator working on the project, in which, yeah, that's as perfect as you get. In conclusion, there's a lot that really goes into putting a comic, manga, or graphic novel to the big screen correctly. But I really wanted to highlight what transitions and processes there are to bring us to the closest possible thing to an accurate portrayal of a comic to the big screen. I hope you guys enjoyed this little presentation. Let's hope that we see more great comic adaptations in the future, because that doesn't look good.